I'm Damian Bassich, and this is California Frontier, the show about the fascinating history of California and the West. Well, hello, everyone. I think you're going to enjoy this third and final part of my conversation with Marie Christine Duggan. In this last part, we really dig into the life and adventures and personality of Juan Francisco Bodega y Cuadra, who was the naval officer that Marie was speaking about when we ended the second part of the interview. Now, we're going to talk about, especially Marie is going to talk about Bodega's financial and family connections, which were really important to his success, but that also probably drove some of his desire to prove himself, right? And then we're going to get into his skills with diplomacy and negotiating with native peoples and with negotiating with the British at a time when Spain and Britain were officially at war. So I think that this third part really is going to help reveal some of the complexities of the whole Spanish colonial economic system, but also the types of motivations that drive historical figures, which aren't always the ones that we would expect. So I hope you enjoy it.
Bodega was always broke. He always needed money. That would be something that he faced all his life, that he never had enough money. But I don't think, if he were truly motivated to get rich, he could have got rich, but that wasn't his primary motivation, right? His primary motivation was to prove himself, probably something inside himself, in addition to wanting to move up in the ladder. And he does become the commander of San Blas at a certain point. And he was an amazing sailor. He was an amazing navigator. And as a person, he inspired people. There's one point where the crew on their ship says, "We don't want to die." And Bodega gives them this talk like, "Well, I don't want to die either. Morel doesn't want to die. Our point isn't to die here, but we've already made it this far, and let's go for the glory before we turn around." And the crew is inspired by him until not only does everybody have scurvy, but Bodega also has a fever, and Morel does too. And this is about when they're on their way back, and they do stop at Bodega Bay on that return journey. Actually, they probably stopped at Tamales Bay, but Tamales Bay and Bodega are kind of sisters. And I've been to Tamales Bay, and it seemed very quiet to me, but I guess Tamales Bay has a very narrow opening. And at certain times of day, the water just rushes through that. And they get kind of trapped in that. And it's, near-death experience once again, but they live through it. They don't think there is anybody in San Francisco, so they sail down to Monterey and, with the fevers and the scurvy. And I think that the missionaries at Carmel have to treat Bodega Morel for about a month before they are, well enough to continue.
So, by any chance when it's named after? It is named after him, right?
It is named after him. Yeah, no, I don't know, but I would imagine. Yeah, you have to look that up. There's so many things we don't know. So Bodega y Cuadra was one of 12 children born to a very wealthy merchant in Lima. And that means that when he was commander of San Blas, he had personal relationships with native people at Nootka and also with merchants in Lima. So he had this huge breadth of connection on the Pacific. Now, his father was a very wealthy merchant. His brother, Antonio, he had there were 8 living siblings. 4 died in their youth. And some of them were a lot older than him. And they were very powerful people. One of them becomes an oidor of Mexico City before he's dead, which that's a cross between being a Supreme Court justice and a congressperson. And another one became got a PhD in law and went and taught in Spain. And he published 2 books. And he was the first Peruvian ever to teach law in a Spanish university. And his his next youngest brother, Alberto, that he grew up with, inherited his father's business in Lima. And I think one of the reasons, I mean, I'm suspecting, but if I were making the movie, one of the reasons Bodega was so anxious to prove himself is that compared to his siblings, he did not have the shiny, exciting job. Of course, of all these people now, none of them are famous. And Bodega has a bay named after him, and there's a museum for him in Lima. But at the time, his salary was pretty miserable, and he wasn't making money, right? Which clearly his family valued. And I think one reason he was always out of money is because he probably tried to have the same standard of living that he'd had growing up, right? I mean, I think all of us a little bit, we think of whatever the standard of living was in the family when we were 8. That's kind of where we're aiming for as a baseline. And so he was never quite had enough. Now,
he wasn't a frugal naval officer.
No, he wasn't, but he also never made money. He had so many opportunities to make money, and he helped everybody around him make money. People say San Blas was corrupt under his management. Well, okay, you can say that. But let's face it, the rules that the king had put in place were designed to keep everybody in miserable, wretched state. And so the people who worked with Bodega y Cuadra really appreciated the opportunity to supplement their income. So his girlfriend in San Blas was the daughter of the wealthiest merchant there, Miguel Marin del Valle, and he financed silver mines. He had a son-in-law with a store in Guadalajara. And for him, I'm sure that having a man as his sort of son-in-law that sailed into the otter fields was a way for him to add to his business. I don't know why they never got married. Maria Gertrudis, she remained living in her father's home. She had Juan Francisco's son, Juan Francisco Jr. Now, the Peruvian biographer of Juan Bodega Cuadra says that he was allowed to have 2 servants with his official job, but he had 8. That there were 8 servants on his payroll. And biographer's like, well, I'm looking into his household and I can see 6 servants, but who are the other 2? And he wonders if the other 2 might not be his girlfriend and his son, and that he was padding payroll so that he could provide child support. And again, this is one of those things where you could easily condemn it, but I am a single mother and I really appreciate the child support. So I think, the morality of that really depends on your perspective. And now, the Spanish went to Nootka 74, 75, and 79, and then they stopped. And why? Well, because actors connected to the king, they're called Bourbon reformers. He was from the House of Bourbon. They were in Mexico City, and they wanted to do this project of making San Blas more of a commercial port. So there's a guy named Areche who actually came to San Blas and sailed with Bodega to Lima. So he asked Lima to organize a ship from San Blas to Lima, which was not an official route, but they wanted to set a precedent and kind of make it an official route. So in 1777, Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra did that. And that maybe explains why there was a gap between 75 and 79 in going to Nootka Sound. But then...
Because they're heading down to Lima. And I mean, other people could still have sailed ships, but I think the big energy and the best navigator is occupied sailing to Lima. And he made money on that voyage. Everybody who sailed from New Spain to Lima always brought Asian products. And Bodega did have the right to bring some products. I think he has the right to bring tar and earthen jars, but I suspect he brought more than that. And this is semi-official since the crown's person, Antonio Areche, is on board also. And he's using Bodega's connection. And they sail on a Peruvian merchant ship called the Phoenix. And the official line is you have to go to Lima and buy a ship for the San Blas Navy,
which is a weird excuse because San Blas was a shipyard, right? They could have built their own ship.
Oh,
But he does go to Lima. He does it in 2 months. He gets a ship called La Favorita. And La Favorita is kind of Bodega's favorite go-to ship after that. And then he comes back. Okay, now war breaks out. Why? Because the American Revolution happens in 1776 and Spain is on the side of the United States. So we often have heard that France is on the side of the United States. Well, France and Spain are always together. So France and Spain were,
Bourbons.
what's that?
They're both Bourbon families on the thrones.
Right. They're both from the House of Bourbon. So because of that, they war breaks out between Spain and Britain, 1779 to 1784. Now, whenever there's war between Spain and Britain, it's really hard to supply New Spain from Spain in the Atlantic because the British blockade the coast of New Spain, and the British also have ships in the Caribbean. So 90% of New Spain's imports came, or 95 came from Spain. So the normal tendency of the population would be to purchase contraband goods from the English in the Caribbean. So the Spanish crown is at war with Britain, and they don't want the population of New Spain to be buying products from the enemy.
Makes
And-
sense.
Yeah. So it's always the case that whenever there's war between Spain and Britain, Pacific trade just blossoms. Spain removes all restrictions on trade with Asia and tries to get as much cloth from Asia pouring into the Pacific side of the Americas. So 1779 to 1784 was a wild opportunity to make wild profits on trade between San Blas and Manila and San Blas and Lima. So in 1781, the same people again asked Bodega to take a ship to Lima. Well, this time a lot of merchants are involved. The official reason is to go get mercury. Mercury is a key ingredient to refining silver. Usually New Spain gets it from the Almaden mine in Spain, but when that's not an option, you can go to the Huancavelica mine in Peru and get mercury. So the official reason is please go to Peru and get mercury with a San Blas Navy ship. But unofficially, and even government people are involved with filling that ship with merchandise. And a bodega is accused of using some of the supplies for the California missions on this merchandise expedition. He says, no, I just used my inheritance. We don't know. Anyway,
And later, there's going to be, thanks to the Santa Clara mission, you'll have the new Almaden mine in what's today San Jose, where they mined mercury.
yeah, that's right. That was like in the 1830s, and it was a huge
Yeah.
breakthrough. And it was, again, for that region, the Gulf of California. It was run out of San Blas. The man who owned it lived in San Blas, and he was bringing mercury from San Jose for the silver mines in Sonora and Mazatlan. So that was a huge, useful thing. But if we go back now to 1781, Bodega, he had such a fat ship with merchandise that and it's La Favorita, his go-to ship, when they're out in the ocean after a week, he says, this isn't going to work. We have to turn around and get a bigger ship. So they go back, take all the stuff off the Favorita, and the Santiago was waiting to deliver to California. So they take all the stuff off the Santiago, and the Santiago is twice as big as La Favorita. So they move everything onto the Santiago, and he sets sail again for Peru. Well, when they get to Guayaquil, which is Ecuador, it's the country right above Peru, the official story is they could not get through because the currents were against them at that time of year. And maybe that's true. I don't know. It could be that ship was so overloaded that they, for some reason, couldn't get through. But what they do is they go to Panama for 4 or 5 months. And Panama is well known as a place for British contraband goods to come in. So I do wonder if during this wartime crisis of high prices, they might have added some British goods. but that is purely my speculation. I have no proof about that. Um, and anyway, after 4 or 5 months in Panama, they finally get to Lima. It takes them a whole year to get to Lima. They meet up with Bodega's brother, Alberto, who's the businessman. And Alberto has already sent another ship filled with mercury to New Spain. So now Bodega's in trouble because he has spent so much money on his voyage. And the whole reason to get the government to pay for it is that they were bringing mercury back to New Spain. And then someone says, well, the viceroy says, please take these cannon to San Blas, because you could really not bring cannon on mules. So you had to get them from another port. So that's a huge relief because now he has a good cover for the voyage. But, not everyone bought that. And he was called to Mexico City when they get back and reprimanded. And they said, how could you, charge the state 6,000 pesos for you and your family on this ship? But first of all, there were people in the government that had wanted this voyage to take place as a test case of Lima-San Blas trade. And secondly, Bodega y Cuadra was a very charismatic man and a national hero. So he got out of that. But I did want to say that those expeditions to Peru were very distracting for the San Blas Navy. And the wild story of the Sonora going to the far north, that got into the paper in Madrid. And some people think that's how Captain James Cook, the British, learned about Nootka Sound. We don't really know how he learned about Nootka Sound, but in 1778, James Cook sailed into Nootka Sound and his men get 300 otter hides, and they make so much money when they get to Canton that in 1784, they published this. Cook has meanwhile died, but the word gets out in 1784 that you can make a ton of money on otter hides. And, so maybe it's a good idea not to advertise and make all this money, because then people from all over the world, Americans, British, they went to Nootka Sound, and the San Blas Navy had not followed up. They didn't go between 1780 and 1787. And that's when people like John Kendrick from New England, or Captain Gray from Salem, or Colnet, the British East India Company, New Spain's worst enemy, they all were in there. And by the time the Spanish came back in 1788, there were so many. And the Spanish Navy did arrest them. Esteban Martinez was commander. He did arrest the British. But at that point, 1790 was not a good time to make trouble with the British, because the French had just had a revolution and they'd killed their king. And so the Spanish king did not have an ally in France. So he could not at that moment pick a war with Britain. And he let the British, in 1790, he agreed the British could establish a settlement to the north of the Spanish. But the story actually doesn't end there, because saying that they could establish a settlement to the north of the Spanish was very vague. And
Right.
yeah,
I was going to say, what does that mean?
Yeah, what do you think it means?
Well, what would it mean? It would probably mean what is today Washington State or British Columbia, right? Because at the time, I think that the Spanish were claiming everything all the way up into, well, definitely past Cape Mendocino, right? And probably up into Oregon.
Yes, and that is the way the Spanish interpret it. They say everything to the north of Nootka Sound, which is 49 degrees in British Columbia, that's where the British can settle. But the British said, no, we interpret it to mean everything to the north of San Francisco, like including Bodega Bay. And so there's a lot of delay. And I think, this was a very weak time for Spain, but the men of the San Blas Navy, they felt like Nootka Sound was theirs, or everything, Bodega Bay was theirs. And so Bodega is commander at this time. And in 1792, he is sent to negotiate with Vancouver. And he pulls off another amazing job. He, first of all, Bodega makes very good friends with Maquina, who was the powerful chief at Nootka Sound. And Maquina ate at his table and slept in his house. And everybody else was afraid. They were putting out rumors that the indigenous people of Nootka Sound were cannibals. So everybody else was terrified to do that. And here Bodega was sharing his bedroom at night while he's asleep with Maquina. And Maquina was very close to Bodega. So then when they invited Vancouver for dinner, they would all sit together. This shocked Vancouver that Maquina was at the dinner table. And also, a third of the supplies from California disappeared that year. And I think Bodega is hoarding stuff, and he has these lavish dinners way up in Nootka. And he just looks like he's in command of the situation. There's 7 ships. The Malspina expedition passes through, so that adds 2. And there's 7 Spanish ships sailing around in this area. And the indigenous chief clearly thinks Bodega's the guy. And they have these, he throws out all this generosity, which was always, of course, Bodega's strength. And so Vancouver is actually in a pretty bad bargaining position. And so the Spanish interpretation holds that the British can have everything above Nootka Sound. And in 1791 or 2, Bodega writes to the viceroy, we only got 300 otter hides here at Nootka Sound this year, and it's just not worth fighting over. So let the British have it. And again, that's clearly an indication that the Spanish were involved in the otter trade, right? But you could say that's not the only reason they were there. And in fact, I think if the Spanish had been the ones doing the otter trade wouldn't be extinct at this point, because they did have other reasons for being there. They did have the explore it, hold it for the king, create missions. And so they weren't like obsessed over getting otter hides in the same way as the Americans and the British who came. They wanted at least 2,000 otter hides for every boat because that was their only reason for going.
That's an interesting hypothesis, exactly, that maybe the Spanish wouldn't have decimated the otter population in the way that the Americans and the British did, because they had other things in mind.
It wasn't their entire livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
They were getting paid by the state. They didn't have to make it. It wasn't all the profit motive. Although I think Esteban Martinez, one of the years, the third year that Vicente Fasadre was sent by the Spanish crown, and he was given a monopoly right to collect hides. And, frankly, I don't think anybody really liked him getting that. Like, they already had this line, and they didn't really want to give it up. But, I think they also thought, well, maybe with Crown's approval, we can expand it. But when it didn't expand, I think people thought, well, let's go back to the way we were doing it. But anyway, in the third year, Esteban Martinez gives Fasadre 4,000 or 5,000 of the hides that he sells. The rest come from the California missions. He has a total of 7,000. And he's only captured 1,000 or 2,000 in the past. And in 1789, he has 7,000. And that's the year Esteban Martinez is in Nootka. And he says some of the hides are from Esteban Martinez. So it just looks to me like it's 4,000 or 5,000. So there was a year where and I didn't really get to mention 2 things that I think are really important, is that when the Spanish didn't go to Nootka, which was 1780 to 87, they were selling hides in Manila. 1782, there were all kinds of rumors going around Manila about these amazing hides. And that means that those years they got the hides from the California missions or the California presidios or unconverted California Indians, because they didn't go to Nootka those years. So it was the regular supply line. Cañizares, probably. He was another San Blas guy. He was sailing to California and coming back with, and in 1785, Cañizares retires from the San Blas Navy. And, unofficially, everybody said, well, because he made a ton of money in the otter trade in China. And the San Blas Navy was selling a lot to Manila in those years. And so that's all before Vicente Fasadre even got a contract And that's usually the way it is, right? That the big money is made before word gets out.
Right. Right. All the people who get in on who get stocks and stock options before the IPO are the ones who make the money.
Yeah. So before we go, I just wanted to say that a really good book about um, the voyage in 1775 is it's edited by Herbert K. Beals. It's called Four Travel Journals, and it's published by the Hakluyt Society. And one of the travel journals is the voyage in 1775 on the tiny Sonora, where everybody's wet constantly.
Mm.
And there's a lot of what I learned about Bodega comes from this beautiful book written by a Peruvian, Jorge Ortiz Sotelo, um, which is it's called Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra, un peruano en la Real Armada. And it's published by the Maritime Museum in Lima in 2019. And you probably would have a hard time getting that. But if you speak Spanish, puedes mandarme un correo y te lo mando. And there's also a really wonderful article by Guadalupe Pinzon at UNAM, which is the largest university in Mexico City. She's really breaking ground by bringing the Gulf of California in. And it's published in a book edited by Maria del Pilar Martinez Lopez Cano. Quite the name, Maria del Pilar Martinez Lopez Cano. And the book is called Historia del Pensamiento Económico. And the chapter is about opening, it's called Apertura Comercial entre los Puertos Peruanos y San Blas, the opening of trade between Peru and Lima.
So maybe I'll follow up, get those titles from you, and at least link them below in the show notes, or so that at least Spanish speaking people can and people interested in this kind of scholarship can get a hold of them if possible. And
there is a
follow
book
up.
written by Freeman Tubble about Bodega.
All right. Well, we'll put that one down there too. Marie, thank you. As always, my mind has been expanded. It's going to take me a while to really absorb all of this, but it really helps me to contextualize more what's going on here in Alta California. Also, just to understand the geography of where we are. It helps to expand our conception of place, right? And all the sort of roots and shoots and rhizomes, as if this place were a plant that has connections all over the hemisphere, across both sides of the Pacific, and of course to Europe as well. So I really think you're adding a lot of knowledge to not just history, but economic history, understanding of specific people that we don't know as well, that we should know, like Bodega y Cuadra, and just helping us grow our minds. So I want to thank you. And of course, I'll link up everything you've talked about so that people can follow up with it. And if you haven't listened to the earlier interviews, the earlier conversations, and read Marie's stuff, you really should. It's going to expand your knowledge and really help you to better understand some of the nuances of the history of Alta California and how it fits in to this whole big world and how it connects to what we're living today. So thank you so much.